So in this session, we're going to cover eating disorders and what the typical disorders look like, their criteria, the experiences that people have with these eating disorders, its prevalence, and the therapeutic interventions and how those might pan out. And so here's a little vignette that says, I no longer clearly remember the first time I forced myself to throw up. What I do remember is how inexpert I was and how long it took before I succeeded in actually vomiting instead of just gagging and retching. It didn't occur to me that what I was doing was dangerous. Instead, it seemed a smart and practical way of coping with things. Surely this meant I was in control. And so the reason we're talking about eating disorders in this section is because eating disorders, like substance abuse, is a disorder of control where people exercise their control over their eating behavior as a way to feel in control of their life. Similarly, people's use of drugs or alcohol or things like that is a control disorder because they use drugs or alcohol to feel in control of their life. Turning back to eating disorders, the current sociocultural climate is one in which we really emphasize image. We have a supersized society where it's really important to recognize that there's abundance of food, not a scarcity, but we're also having all these cultural messages from TV shows, magazines, movies, and the internet of the perfect person. By and large, people do not look perfect. In fact, very few people look perfect, but that's actually what we see in the media all the time. And so these body ideals and messages, they're by whom? They're by, these big mega national corporations who want you to buy their product or they want you to watch their show. And who are they for? Well, they're typically targeted at adults, but also kids. Also some of these shows are targeted at kids or kids in adolescence who are really impressionable and who really are struggling with body image. And so kids are surrounded by these images and these ideals, and it's important to understand who develops eating disorders. That's what ED is here and why. And so this climate is broad. We see it everywhere across the United States. It's on all these outlets. But why do only some people develop eating disorders? If everybody's exposed, wouldn't more children be vulnerable? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we're thinking about eating disorders, there's different diagnostic criteria, but the ones here is that it's a persistent, altered pattern of food consumption with impaired physical or psychosocial health. There's preoccupation with weight and shape. There's 3 typical types of eating disorder. So for each of these, there's individual characteristics, but these are the diagnostic criteria for all of them, the broader diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder. What we'll talk about today is anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. Each of these eating disorders broadly is characterized by food intake not supporting growth and development. It leads to physical deficiencies, and there's a focus on appearance. The first is anorexia nervosa, or AN, and this is where there's low body weight because of restricted food intake and excessive exercise. Psychologically, it's characterized by an intense fear of gaining weight and psychologically cognitive distortions about weight or appearance. So individuals, adolescents who have anorexia nervosa literally look in the mirror and they see themselves as fat, even though they may be incredibly skinny, their ribs may be sticking out. They see themselves as fat and they focus on those bones, but they see those bones in their body as possible fat deposits. And there's 2 subtypes. One is restricting, where they actually restrict what they eat and they have excessive exercise. And another is binge eating and purging. So they will eat, but then they purge or they force themselves to vomit. And so this is different from bulimia nervosa, where people have typical normal weight. They don't have severely low weight. What bulimia nervosa is characterized as is excessive binge eating or lots of excessive calories, usually in what's called a binge episode. So excessive food intake in a discrete episode in an uncontrolled manner. And so oftentimes these adolescents report it can feel dissociative, or they don't feel connected to their body. Basically, they're eating and it feels good to them, but they're not really in control of their body. They feel kind of an out-of-body experience because of that. And it's followed by purging, so that's a compensatory behavior to prevent the weight gain. So they're purging by either extreme dieting, use of laxatives, restricted eating, or making themselves vomit. In bulimia nervosa, self-evaluations are highly influenced by their body weight and their shape. So psychologically, they're focused on how their body looks, and how their body looks is directly tied to their kind of self-esteem. So if I think my body looks good, then I feel good about myself. But if today I think my body looks bad, then I feel bad about myself. And they often have guilt, shame, and self-contempt, so they often feel bad about themselves. And when they feel bad about themselves, this can trigger a binge eating episode. The binge eating episode then makes them feel good. They feel out of body. They feel good. They feel like they're feeling good. They feel this high, but then they have to purge to prevent that weight gain. And so they feel a lack of self-control because of these binge eating and purging episodes, but also because of their self-evaluations. And then finally, a vignette here is that when I was vomiting, I was doing it 4, 5, 6 times a day. I'd become addicted to the sensation. It was no longer a penance I had to perform, but the reward at the end of a binge. I loved the feeling after purging of being clean and shiny like a scrub machine. Superhuman. I would rise from the bathroom floor, splash my face with cold water, vigorously brush the acid from my mouth. I would take a wet cloth, wipe off the vomit that had spattered my arms, and feel as energized as someone who had just woken up from a nap. I felt as if everything inside me had been so displaced that I was now outside myself. Not only all of the food I'd eaten, but my entire past. No one could tell me to stop. They could not control this part of my life or another. This was mine alone. So this really kind of highlights how this is an eating disorder centered around control, how this individual, this adolescent, feels like they have control over this aspect of their life. They have control over their eating, they have control over their purging, and it makes them feel like they have control over some small portion of their life. Maybe they don't feel that way at school or at home or with friends, but this they do have control over. And finally, there's binge eating disorder. Binge eating is binge eating without compensatory behaviors. So it's not simply eating a little bit too much. It is these discrete binge eating episodes where they're eating high amounts of calories, lots of food, and doing it in one sitting, but without these purging behaviors. So, and this is shown to have the most rapid recent increases as far as prevalence in society. And so if we think about the 3 eating disorders, we've talked about anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is simply these binge episodes where people are eating really lots of food without purging. That's kind of the one characteristic of binge eating disorder. And there's really this dissociative state during, but then afterwards, no real psychological kind of distortions. However, if we flip back to bulimia nervosa, the way to differentiate this and anorexia nervosa is characterized by that low body weight, that's specific to anorexia. It's also characterized by these cognitive distortions where people see themselves as overweight even though they are definitely not. Compared to bulimia nervosa, they typically have normal weight, so anorexia, low weight, bulimia, normal weight. Anorexia, cognitive distortions where they see themselves as overweight even though they're not. And here, they see their bodies as normal. In bulimia nervosa, adolescents see their body for the reality of what it is, but rather than feeling distorted about it or seeing it in a distorted light, they see it as it is, but their self-evaluations are tied to their body weight and shape. So that's kind of the way that these three eating disorders are differentiated from one another. As far as prevalence, anorexia nervosa, that's AN, is less than 1% and it's higher in older teens. Bulimia nervosa is 1 to 2% and it peaks in late adolescence and young adulthood. And binge eating disorder has the highest rate here of 3 to 4%. We know that it's 10 times more likely that a female will have a binge eating disorder, a bulimia nervosa, or anorexia nervosa, any of the eating disorders, than males. And there's also high comorbidity between things like depression, anxiety, OCD, substance use and personality disorders, and eating disorders. And these either may precede the eating disorder or the eating disorder may precede these comorbid disorders. So all in all, binge eating disorders don't have a terribly high rate, but they are very serious. The characteristics and experiences of children, we've already seen a few vignettes of what people feel like when they have these episodes. But in general, they usually have poor self-esteem, depression, and irritability. They basically have low self-worth, low feelings of self-esteem, and they're preoccupied with food, so they're always thinking about, what am I going to eat? Am I going to binge? Should I eat right now? They see weight loss as an accomplishment and weight gain as a failure of self-discipline or self-control. And there's their evaluations of themselves, what they think of themselves, are directly tied to their image. So these people, when they're preoccupied with food and their weight, they're very vigilant about what they food, what they cook, how they cook it, where they go out to eat, the recipes they collect. And they don't recognize the actual severity of their eating disorder. They don't acknowledge the underlying fear and anxiety related to eating. And they can even deny the whole problem or not kind of get that they have this preoccupation with weight and shape or the medical severity of some of these eating disorders. They have this fear of weight gain, which can lead to slowly decreasing weight to the point where it's severely unhealthy. A lot of times this can lead to social isolation. People may want to help these people, but they don't know how, or these people refuse to get help. And because of that, it can lead to people both feeling low self-esteem and depressed, so they withdraw from friends, but then people withdrawing from them because they don't know how to help them. And so kind of here's a vignette from near the end of someone's experience with an eating disorder. It ended not because of willpower or therapy, it ended because the pain from throwing up rendered the pleasure slight by comparison. It ended when my softened teeth cringed at every mouthful, and I awoke several times each night with cramps racking my stomach. It ended when I arrived at the point where I could not feel my feet. I had developed a hiatal hernia. A portion of my stomach protruded through my esophagus, and my teeth became so compromised that one day one of them simply disintegrated under pressure. The last time I forced myself to throw up, it felt like internal surgery. I had been bulimic off and on for 8 years, and all that vomiting and not purged myself of any of the things that were making me sick. So eating disorders really have severe physical consequences, even though they're psychological disorders. So these physical consequences really are not only weight loss, even though that's one of the primary things, but there's also a whole host of physical consequences as well. These physical consequences involve skin, teeth, and bone alterations from not having adequate nutrition, growth retardation because these individuals simply don't grow, hormonal imbalances because these people aren't getting the right nutrition just to develop, typically at adolescence, a time when you need extra calories for the hormonal changes taking place. Cardiac disturbances, gastrointestinal problems, biochemical abnormalities, menstrual irregularity, and amenorrhea. And the effects of anorexia nervosa can be more severe because in anorexia nervosa, they're simply not getting enough calories at all. In bulimia, they are getting calories and they typically have normal weight, but they do have these episodes of binging and purging, so they are getting some calories. But in anorexia nervosa, they're simply not getting enough calories at all.